Welcome to my sewing room. In this video I'm making Regency stays using a pattern by Laughing Moon EM-1010. I want to make a Regency dress, and like for every historical era, the correct shape is achieved by wearing the specific undergarments. Even in the Regency era, where the shape is not as elaborate as, let's say, Victorian, there are some specific underthings to make things sit correctly. Here you can see me working on the mock-up. I never made a pair of stays before, so I needed to get an idea of how this would fit me. The mock-up was put up together quickly, and here's my first impression of the fit. I found it to be a little too long for me, so I shortened the pattern. I also took a bit off from the side seams. Other than that, it's fitting quite well. Because at this point I didn't have the bust yet, I used my ruler as a substitute. Now I'm ready for cutting my fabric, which is a cotton twill if I remember correctly. And where fresh fabric is about to be unfolded, the actual heads of the household are never far away. Here you can see all the pieces: a front piece on the fold, a front side piece, the bust and hip cores, and the back piece. First thing to do was sewing the bust and hip cores. These are very important for the shape and support function of this garment. I like to use my tracing wheel and waxed paper whenever I need to transfer markings like that. I bought these sheets over a decade ago and still using the same piece. They last a very long time. This mostly works on lighter fabrics though. Then I snipped into these markings to get the slits for the gussets. They then get some stay stitching to prevent fraying and make these edges fold easy on the next step. Now I could pin the gussets to the slits. I started with the bust cores. They were stitched in with a 1/4 inch or 0.6 cm seam allowance. The very bottom of the gore is not sewn in. You will leave that open. There is no seam allowance at this point, and we will top stitch and floss these corners anyway. And here's your friendly reminder to press your seams. Before I top stitched the gores, I pinned these open areas close. Now you can already see the shape that the gores create. That applies to most other eras too. It's the shape of the piece that makes the curves, not the boning alone. The boning helps to keep the fabric taut. Now I start the same procedure for the hip gussets. After doing this for the outer fabric and the lining, I now had this lovely pile. Now onto the back pieces. I gave myself some extra seam allowance on the shoulder as well as on the side seams. This is because of the cording. The fabric can shrink a little. To make sure I don't end up with a piece that's too small, I added these extra centimeters. Next thing to do, pinning and stitching the back seam. Again pressing my seams. Because we will have the seam allowance of the outer and the inner fabric be on top of each other here, I graded them to reduce bulk before I moved on to the back seam. This is where the eyelets will be, so it is stitched right sides together. Here we go, 2 nicely finished back edges. Look at those curves! And here comes number 1 of the time-consuming part about this, marking the channels for the cording. This took a while. To transfer these, I got a light tablet, which you can get for about 20 euro or so. I started drawing in the lines and realized that I probably should do this on the fabric and not on the paper. Like I said, this took a while.
2,000 years later.
And then another while to stitch all these channels. The things we do for art. To pull the cording through the small channels, I used a very large needle. It is called a doll needle in Germany. It might have another name anywhere else. Number 2. Getting it caught in was a lot of wiggling and pulling at times. I even used pliers on some parts. This also took a lot of time, but it's worth it, I promise. Here are the corded back pieces, and I think this already looks so nice. Moving on to the front piece, which had even more intricate cording pattern. So by now we all know what that means, drawing a lot of lines until it eventually looks like this. I also wanted a little bit of embroidery on the front piece, so I used my Bernina machine and one of her many decorative stitches. Maybe it was also a chance to procrastinate more cording? We will never know. To be able to stitch the cording channels, the lining and the outer fabric are put together wrong sides facing. After sewing many lines, I could erase the markings again with my iron because I had used my friction pen. After cording all of the front piece, I was left with these spaghettis hanging out from it. Now let's get rid of them. Now I was able to cut off the extra seam allowances. I made sure to check the pieces against the pattern piece first. It did not shrink too much, but you never know. To mark the eyelets, I used this handy tool. I had my eye on this thing for years, but for this project I finally decided to get it. Here are some things we need for the next step, sewing the eyelets by hand. I made some samples with a machine sewn eyelet, but it really didn't work on this fabric, so hand sewing it is. I usually find those parts quite relaxing. To make these, I used an awl to make a hole in the fabric without breaking the fibers, like a hole punch would. This tool only shifts the fibers away and makes the eyelet more durable, because no fabric can fray around the edge. And then I added the straps. The outer fabric strap piece gets sewn to the outer fabric seam allowance and the lining strap goes onto the lining fabric. This way the seam allowances are sandwiched in between and look nice from both sides, and are also very nice on the skin. After stitching these on, I graded the seam allowances to reduce bulk again. Then I stitched all around the straps to secure them. Before I stitched the side seams, I pinned them to make one last fitting. It is possible to make some minor adjustments through the seam before stitching it together permanently. I also had purchased my wooden bus at this point, although it might not have been cut yet. I was happy with the fit, so I pinned the side seams, leaving the lining part free. This gets finished by hand in a minute. Seam allowance of the lining is folded under and then stitched down by hand. This way there are no open seam allowances on the inside. Time for the boning. Now, there are only a few pieces of steel boning in this to keep the back edge sturdy where the eyelets are and to help keeping the fabric flat on the side seam. There are also two shorter pieces of plastic boning and the bust area. Cutting the spiral steel is always fun. I try to do it over my trash bin, but some more pieces are landing somewhere else. Please be careful when you do this. Adding the little caps for the spiral boning is a skill that I yet have to master. They kind of have a life of their own. Sometimes I wrap them in isolation tape to prevent them from getting loose in the channels. Now it was time to bind all those edges. This was done in sections. The first one was the area around the straps until the beginning of the front piece. I stitched it down with a machine and then finished it by hand. Time for my handy clips, cause otherwise I would stab myself every 2 seconds. Now I could move on to the front piece. After stitching the bias tape on my machine, I had to do something else. I had to do 2 more eyelets. These got stitched into the bias tape because this also acts as a tunnel for some drawstrings. This way this edge can be tightened a little to keep, you know, everything in that area safe inside the stays. The drawstring was stitched down on the sides and then fed through the eyelet. After that I finished the bias tape like you normally would. There is an unwritten law to get very excited when you're close to the finishing, so you have to do a mini try on. Here you can see an opening that I left on the seam to be able to get the bust in and out for washing purposes. I was lying earlier. There are more eyelets to do. One on the strap and one on the front, or rather 4. And before I could call this one done, I had to do the flossing on the bust and hip gores. Remember the little points? This helps strengthen this area. I hope you enjoyed this video. There's one more video coming that covers making a Regency dress, and I also have a Regency playlist if you want to see more of the things I made for this outfit. If you want to support this channel, please leave a like, and if you want to see more, consider subscribing. I'll see you in my next video. Bye bye!